Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome to Kerbol's space program Beyond Kerbol, a brand new career mode series which is continuing on from Kerbol's space program Endurance. We are in a brand new version, 1.7.3, the most up-to-date version of Kerbol's space program, although probably not for long since 1.8 is fast approaching. Finally, I can actually use making history and breaking ground, because previously we were in 1.3.1. So yeah, we jumped 4 major versions and 2 expansions, and I can certainly tell you it was no easy task getting this save file to work. But thankfully, after losing a couple of mods which don't work anymore, adding a few more, and tinkering with the save file and a few craft, I managed to get it all working so we can continue our plight out into the interstellar void. So I'm aware that some people may be hopping on this series now without having watched KSP Endurance. Now I do highly recommend that you go watch that series first, but if you haven't and you can't be bothered, I will do my best to explain what's going on. So this is essentially set in a universe where life evolved much later on Kerbin, about 4 billion years later, in fact. So Kerbol is actually starting to die, and by the time Kerbol's reached the space age, Kerbin was almost completely uninhabitable. So only a few hundred Kerbols actually managed to escape out here to Duna, and then over the next few hundred years terraform it gradually and rebuild their society. And that is where KSP Endurance began. We began relearning the methods of space exploration, how to build rockets, and how to get Kerbols back up into space, because of course relocating to Duna is only a very temporary solution, and we need to launch a colony ship Interstellar and actually colonize a world around a new star and find a permanent new home. So let's just head into the tracking station and we can show the new face of the Kerbol system, because after 4 billion years it certainly looks very different to how I'm sure many of you remember it being. So here we are. First of all, Moho is completely gone. It's been swallowed by Kerbol, or Archangel as it is now known. Next out we have Demise, or the new name for Eve, and its atmosphere has been completely stripped away, with only very few hints of its previous purple sheen. Next out we have the Wasteland, which is the home of Kerbalkind, and it is now completely uninhabitable. Now we did send a manned mission here and also a manned mission to Demise in the previous series, so I'd highly recommend you go watch them first if you want to know all of the history. But we did explore the ruined Kerbal Space Center and explored the surface with a number of probes as well. Next out we have Malice. This is actually a body, I think one of the only bodies we haven't actually landed something on yet, and as you can see, Minmus actually crashed into the moon, creating these sort of green smears across the surface, and Wasteland's now rather beautiful ring system. If we go a little bit further out, we have of course got Duna, now renamed Solitude, which is the planet that Kerbols now call home. You can see we have quite a lot of spacecraft around this planet, although we used to have a lot more. I've cleared up the save file quite a bit, removed all the debris as you can see, and also removed a lot of the old spacecraft that were no longer functioning, just to try and get the quick save times down a little shorter, because it was taking about 15 seconds to make a save near the end of the last series. I did actually make a sort of montage of all the different spacecraft we launched in the final episode of Endurance, so don't worry, their memory still lives on. So I made that so we know when they were all launched, where they were landed, when they were landed, but now we're going into a new series with a pretty different focus. We can move on from that. Now, Solitude has got 2 moons. Guardian, as you can see here, which has formed over the 4 billion years from the asteroids sort of in between Duna and Kerbin. And then we have Nemesis, which is the new name for Ike, which tidal forces have shaped into a very threatening world. Now, this is the location of our largest colony, which is almost actually self-sufficient. Now we're using a USI, modular colonization system, which means making self-sufficient colonies is very, very difficult. We have life support, habitation time, all sorts of things to think about, but we did almost get there, but it does need one more module, which we will be launching very shortly. Now at the end of the series, we used Artemis to create a huge array of satellites named the Bifrost Array. So we designed, launched and built them on Artemis straight into orbit around Nemesis. And these things have huge solar collectors which they use to generate a huge amount of power and then beam that power using soft X-rays. And then we use that to power a space probe with a plasma thruster named the Endurance, which is now leaving the solar system and heading out to our nearest stellar neighbor, Valentine, where it will arrive in 11 years or so. You can see the patched conics are a little less glitchy in this version of KSP, so we can actually see when it's arriving at Valentine. Before, the patched conics, well, the trajectory ended past the orbit of Eeloo, which wasn't particularly helpful. So let's continue our tour of the new solar system for those of you who may not have seen it previously. Here we have Drizzen, the new face of Dres, that planet that doesn't actually exist. And you see it still has its trademark canyon, and it's looking pretty much the same, just a much better texture than the stock Dres. And it actually has a little companion now, Fisher, and we did land some probes on both of these worlds. I actually used surface sample collection drills, a science instrument from KSP Interstellar, to take surface samples using these probes, and then we returned all 4 of the surface samples, so from 3 biomes on Drizzen and 1 on Fisher, returned them to a mothership, and that is now coming back to Solitude and should arrive in a few hundred days or so. So we're actually doing an automated sample return, which I thought was pretty cool. Next out, we have Reaper, which is the new name for Jewel. Now Reaper is very, very different to how I'm sure many of you remember it, because it is actually not a gas giant anymore. Yeah, Reaper is a massive rocky world with just a very thick atmosphere. You can just about make out some surface features through the atmosphere as it has thinned over the intervening 4 billion years. Now the gravity is still absolutely crushing, and as is the atmosphere. So although we do have a manned mission en route to Reaper right now, named Morningstar, which should arrive in 2 years or so, it has a number of probes with multiple heat shields to survive the atmospheric entry, but we do not actually have any plans to land any Kerbols on Reaper. I mean, they feel like they were made of lead. The surface gravity is something like 3 Gs, so they'd certainly need to work on leg day before they tried that. But we will be exploring the new faces of the moons of Reaper. Now this is Arados, and you can see Lathe has certainly seen better days. Most of its ocean has evaporated, but we did actually land a rover here to explore the surface in the previous series. Next out we have Valm, which is essentially still Pol. It's lost some of its color, some of its sheen, but it's still a pretty small, insignificant body, which we'll be using to actually refuel our Morningstar mission. Next up we have Tylos, which is basically Tylo, but also has a number of huge impact craters on it because Bop has actually crashed into Tylo in the intervening years and has scarred its surface rather dramatically. We will be actually landing on Tylos and actually all of the moons in the Morningstar mission. I'm really quite excited. And next up we have Valiant, probably the most dramatically changed, as its subsurface ocean has now been revealed as the ice has melted. And Morningstar actually has a small manned submarine on board, so we can use that to actually explore the oceans of Val and perhaps find some form of alien life. Who knows? But that will be for a future episode when Morningstar actually arrives. So, zooming out from Reaper, we have one final world, Eltos, and that is the new name, of course, for Eeloo. And as we zoom in, we can see Eeloo has changed much in the same way that Valiant has. Its ice has melted and it actually has a thin atmosphere now. We explored this using our memory probe, and we landed a few probes on the surface as well. So we've landed probes on pretty much everybody in the system, the only exceptions being the moons of Reaper. We've only landed a rover on Arados, and of course we haven't landed anything on the actual main planet itself, because we needed a lot more protection for atmospheric entry than I originally actually included with our probe mission. And we haven't actually landed anything on Malice, the moon of the wasteland, but we will be correcting that in this series. The sort of opening quarter of this series is going to be finishing up in the Kerbol system, so we're going to wait for Morningstar to arrive at Reaper, and we're going to wait for Memento to come back. I'm also thinking we might launch some kind of a mobile colony to the wasteland, and also I want to explore Malice because we haven't landed on that yet. And we pretty much have a lot of unfinished business on the wasteland since our last manned mission. I mean, it got the job done. We landed, we planted a flag, did a bit of research, looked around, but it wasn't a very long-term mission. We lost our lander on Ascent, so we weren't able to actually land on Malice, although we were intending to. And yeah, we could have done it a little bit better, so we're going to have another go at that. But we're going to launch a much larger spacecraft with a mobile base, so we can actually have a proper base of operations and do some serious research there. But that's going to require quite a bit of infrastructure to build, because we're going to be building spacecraft in this series which are much larger than the likes that we can actually launch from the surface of Solitude. So we're going to need to build an orbital construction dock and make sure that we're ready for when Endurance arrives at Valentine in 11 years' time. We want to have our colony ship ready to go in case it does find a habitable world for Kerbals to flee to. I also decided we're not going to be using warp drives in this series. So many people requested that in the last series. They said, Beardy, please, like, especially since the trailer for Kerbal Space Program 2 came out, and they said, you know what, no magic technology, just fusion drives and near future technology. I decided I'm going to do the same. So our future colony vessels all the way out to Valentine, everything is going to be fusion powered. There's going to be no warp drives, no magic. It's all going to be done with using near future technology like a Daedalus fusion engine and the like. So it's going to be pretty exciting, this series. I am going to try and get it finished before KSP2 comes out. That's the plan. Hopefully we can, if I keep up with weekly uploads and have about 20 to 30 episodes in this series, I think I can make that happen. So the first thing we have to do is actually unlock all of the tech we now have available from Making History and Breaking Ground. So a bunch of new command pods, fuel tanks, engines, and of course all of the ground-based science and robotics from Breaking Ground, which we are going to make use of, I guess, a little bit in this episode, but much more so a little later on into the series. What we're also going to do is spend some of the science that we transmitted from Morningstar's science laboratories before we put all of the crew into cryosleep, and we're going to invest that science into some fusion tech, because what we need to get to is specialized fusion rockets, which we just mouse over here, which has the elusive Daedalus fusion engine, which will power our colony ships to another star. But we need quite a bit more science before we can quite grab that tech just yet. So we're going to have to wait until Morningstar arrives at Reaper, most likely in about a year or two. So what we're doing here is we're launching our Asteria launch vehicle from the surface of Nemesis, and basically taking the entire crew of Artemis back home, because most of them are nearing the end of their habitation time, because using USI modular colonization systems, your Kerbals, as well as needing life support, have requirements of habitation space, and after a certain amount of time they need to go home, unless you invest in colonization modules which can freeze those hab timers. So we're going to send them all back, and also when we replace the crew, we're going to have a very different crew makeup, because we don't need anywhere near as many engineers on Artemis now. Building the Bifrost array used a lot of them, because we needed to be churning out these great big orbital mirrors, but from now on, really all Artemis is going to be doing is producing bits and bobs as and when it really needs it. Artemis does need one more module before it's fully self-sufficient, but if we drop the crew roster down from 18 to 12, it'll be self-sufficient on supplies. We just need a small module to add some colonization space, so something to produce colony supplies, which is used to freeze the hab timers of the Kerbals, and also something to combine the material kits and specialized parts we already produce on Artemis into machinery. Now machinery is this resource, if you don't know, that's pretty much used in
in everything. Everything uses a tiny amount of it. Even the production chain to produce machinery uses machinery itself, which I find quite amusing. But once we're producing machinery, we don't have to ship that up there anymore, and we're producing organics, which we can then also combined with material kits and specialized parts to create colony supplies, the base will be able to sustain 12 Kerbals indefinitely, which is certainly the aim. And once we've got that up and running, we don't really need specialized Kerbals. We need a couple of different Kerbals, so we need farmers, biologists, engineers, and the like to make all the different parts run at their peak efficiency. Then the rest of the crew can actually be comprised of colonist Kerbals, which is a special type of Kerbal added by USI, well, amongst plenty of other different special Kerbals, which doesn't actually have any skills. So colonists just boost the output of the colony, because you get certain rewards just by having a colony in place, and having colonists on the colony boosts the amount of funds, science, and reputation you get. So if you don't need Kerbals with specific skills, it's good to send up a bunch of colonists to maximize the rewards you're getting from your off-world base. So the Asteria was actually jam-packed full of exotic minerals and rare metals, and that's earned us a cool 4 million funds worth of cash. Yeah, I mean, we don't really even need to do contract anymore. Artemis has paid for itself about 20 times over, and from now on we're actually going to be sending refined exotics back because we have a massive surplus of them and they're worth way more per kilogram. So we'll actually be earning twice as much every time we send the Asteria back, with a whole buttload of resources from Nemesis. So yeah, we pretty much never need to worry about money again, which is very nice. But Beardy, what are you doing here? You're not sending up the next crew to Artemis. What is this ginormous new launch vehicle that you're using? Well, this is the Atlas launch vehicle. I decided enough of partial reusability. We're going to go all the way and go for full 100% reuse. Well, I say 100%. Pretty much 100% reusability. We're not going to reuse the top fuel tank. We're reusing all of the engines at least. So we are making an effort. And you see, I used a couple of the different parts from reusability expansion. So here we're actually using the New Glenn Blue Origin landing legs on this stage instead of the SpaceX landing legs that we've got on all of the other ones, because I thought, I'd mix it up a little bit, make it look a bit more interesting. But we do pretty heavily redesign this launch vehicle a little later on, I think in the next episode, because it was a bit tall and skinny, so I made pretty much the whole thing 5 meters wide, so try and brought the height down a little bit. And we are using a number of engines that we've now got from making history, and Restock is making them look absolutely beautiful. I mean, look at that engine plume. Oh, it is truly marvelous. But what we're launching here is the beginnings of a brand new space station. At the end of the last series, we deorbited Thea, which was kind of like our equivalent of Mir. It was important for completing a contract and to have a foothold in low solitude orbit and complete all our rescue missions, have a base of operations, but it was old, decrepit. It used a bunch of parts from mods that I wanted to uninstall as well, so we just deorbited it, and now we are replacing it with Tycho Station. Yes, I mean, as if my obsession with the Expanse couldn't get any worse. But before I tell you about Tycho and its marvelous abilities, we need to, of course, reuse all of the various different chunks of our launch vehicle. And for the first time, we're actually reusing our solid rocket boosters. I know, what a revolutionary idea. You see, we're landing all 4 of our boosters around the launch site to be cleaned up, refurbished, and refueled for the next launch. Then, of course, we have our first stage, which we need to turn around. We left a little bit of fuel in the bottom. Not enough to do a powered landing, but just enough to do a little boost back burn. Although not enough to actually get it back to the launch site, enough to slow it down so it survives re-entry and try and minimize the distance from the launch site, because of course the closer to the launch site we land it, the more funds we get back from it. You can see here we're actually using the largest engine supplied by KW Rocketry. I mean, even with all the new parts in making history, we still need to be using KW Rocketry, because when it comes to super heavy lift vehicles, really nothing quite compares to some of the engines, the raw power that we get from that. So then we've got the second stage using its New Glenn style landing legs, which I think looks kind of interesting, but I did do away with it with the next one because there is a limit on how large these landing legs can go. They can only surround 3.75 meter stages. I say only 3.75 meter stages. But yeah, in the future, as I said, I redesigned this rocket to be pretty much entirely 5 meters because it does look a little ridiculous. It's a bit too tall. So yeah, but it's nice to try and use some reusable parts from a different private space company. Even though Blue Origin is lagging seriously behind SpaceX, in the next few years they've got some interesting things planned, and it's certainly someone to keep an eye on. Competition is good. You know, some people are like, you have to support SpaceX or Blue Origin. No, like, we're all in the same race pretty much. Competition is a wonderful thing. So now that we've actually inflated our habitation ring, which used a bunch of material kits we had to put on that third stage there, we can launch that back towards Solitude. And there's actually quite a bit more fuel left in this than I thought there would be. So since we're directly over the space center, I just thought, why don't I just reverse my orbit using the remaining fuel and try and land as close to the space center as possible. However, this stage is a bit unwieldy, especially returning from orbital velocity, which is what I was planning to do, although we've pretty much cancelled out our orbital velocity entirely. But the expensive part of the stage isn't the fuel tank, it is the engine itself. So what I've done is created a detachable engine, which is very similar to ULA's future plans, United Launch Alliance that is, to actually have partial reusability by having the engine detached from the fuel tank and have it be caught while descending on parachutes by a helicopter, which is similar to Rocket Lab's plans, except they want to catch the entire first stage of their Electron rocket, but ULA just want to catch the expensive part, the engine, in the air, which isn't quite as crazy as it might seem. It's a pretty common practice getting film back from spy satellites during the Cold War, so it's actually been perfected, and it's not quite as bonkers as you might imagine. And just look at Restock's job on reskinning the Nerva engine and its plume there. Oh, glorious. So this is the Hesia 1 spacecraft. It's a little nuclear shuttle that we've left in low solitude orbit, and it's pretty useful, so I thought, yeah, why not leave that in orbit and just dock that to our new Tycho station. But Beardy, what is Tycho for? What's all the habitation space, that giant spider-looking thing on the front for? Well, Tycho is an orbital construction dock. I thought it was an appropriate name because it's going to be constructing all of our future massive spacecraft to save us having to launch them from the surface of Solitude, which is going to get harder and harder considering the scale of the things we're going to be building. And considering, as I said, it's going to be building our future interstellar spacecraft, and Tycho in the Expanse, it built the Nauvoo, the interstellar massive generation ship that the Mormons are going to use to fly to Tau Ceti. I thought that was an appropriate name, so there we have it. It's got 6 engineers, all straight off of Artemis, so they've got a fair bit of experience, and they're working on there, and they're going to get our productivity up, so we should be able to produce rockets in orbit. We're going to have to, of course, ship up the material kits and specialized parts, because it's not going to be able to produce them in orbit, so we are going to have to ship them up to there, but it works out much cheaper launching the material kits and specialized parts up to the station and then building the spacecraft in orbit and then fueling them up in orbit rather than launching it all from the ground, because we're getting to the limit of of the sort of hardware we can actually launch into orbit here. Now you see I've actually taken the second stage of the Atlas here and turned it into its own little rocket, because it's already fully reusable, and I thought, okay, we don't need anywhere near as much power as the full Atlas stack gives us, but the second stage alone is still a pretty nifty orbital rocket. And what we're doing here is we're launching a little nuclear tug, except this one has got a 2.5 meter docking port. And what we're going to use that for is actually going to go find a fuel module, which was actually from one of our old interplanetary spacecraft. I believe it was from Odyssey, which went to the wasteland. So it's a relic of an earlier time, but it's full of fuel, so I didn't really see much point in deorbiting it at the end of the last series. However, it is just sort of hanging around in low solitude orbit, not really being particularly helpful. So what we're going to do, once we've actually landed our first stage, you see here, we actually lost communications with it because I forgot to put an antenna onto it, but thankfully we deployed the chute automatically and it landed safely in the ocean. But this nuclear tug is just going to head and find that fuel module, and then it's going to tug it over to Tycho so we can use it to fuel up our future spacecraft. Because of course once you build the spacecraft, you then need to of course launch all of the resources to fill it up as well. You don't get that for free. So we need to have a pretty large supply of fuel in low solitude orbit, so why not just use this? You know, waste not, want not is my sort of approach. You see here, thankfully the fuel module isn't rotating. It does have one tiny reaction wheel on it, but I had to be so careful careful on this approach not to knock it, because although it does have RCS ports, it doesn't actually have any RCS fuel tanks on it. We actually ejected those to save weight during that interplanetary voyage, but thankfully we very carefully managed to dock to the front of it. Although, thinking about it, we probably should have docked to the back, because we're scorching the sides with a radioactive exhaust here, but I'm sure that won't cause any problems. It'll be absolutely fine. And we can just hug this massive, great big fuel tank over to Tycho and dock it for our future missions. Now, Tycho isn't going to be building our Interstellar spacecraft immediately. We don't have the technology yet, and I also want to launch a mission to the wasteland, a much larger scale mission with a mobile base, I think, with use a few robotic parts, make an unfolding like mobile robotic base that has a few drills that can resupply its own life support. I think that could be pretty cool to travel to the different biomes, explore the old ruined KSC, and get all of the science from that planet, and of course visit its moon Malice, which we haven't actually managed to do yet. So that's going to be sort of a test bed for a lot of technologies for when we actually finally go into Stellar. We're going to stick a fusion engine onto it, I think, or at least a fusion reactor to power some fission engines or something like that, and we are going to test a lot of the sort of mobile colony sort of technologies. We've proven that we can make an almost self-sufficient colony. We will finish Artemis in the next episode, but we need to actually be able to compact it down into pretty much a single launch or a single vehicle, because Artemis is comprised of a bunch of different modules we had to launch separately. So if we can sort of refine it all down and get our inputs down to just a couple of resources that we can all mine in just one or two different places, we can sort of, I guess, work on our colony module and hopefully get it all into a single spacecraft that we can send to another star. But thank you very much for watching, everyone. I hope you're looking forward to this series as much as I am. I've been the Beardy Penguin, and I will see you all next time.